Okay. Are we recording? Zach, do you want to start? Sweet. And Lacey?
Recording on this end is all set too.
Sweet. Okay. Everyone can now plug in their respective headphones. I'm going to clap, line it up. Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Press the Button. I'm Michelle Dover, Director of Programs here at Ploughshares Fund. And now, everyone's favorite nuclear Q&A segment, where I decide to jump the line and ask Tom a question. Tom, are you ready for this? How do you see these two components fitting into a productive arms control negotiation process? Based on the recent summit, do you see the potential for that right now? What do you make of the recent strategic stability talks? And where do you see relations headed? I know you were recently in Eastern Europe, so I'm curious to hear your perspective on it.
And if I can just add too, when you think about the technobabble, and not just the way that experts use it to make themselves, and I consider myself an expert, right? And I've been in those situations of you're saying my added value to this conversation is this information, but the way we at certain times weaponized it and said other people can't understand this, and that's what makes me important. That is preventing us from being able to build common cause.
I could talk to you for a lot longer than this, but unfortunately we do have to wrap up. My final question for you, as we take the theory and put it into practice, what can the audience do to help create this long-lasting progress?
And welcome back to Press the Button. Before we get started, I wanted to share some news. This is my last week working at Ploughshares Fund. Let's just say this is a really bittersweet moment for me.
Welcome to this very special episode of Press the Button, where we say farewell to longtime Press the Button co-host and Ploughshares Fund Program Director Michelle Dover, as she heads to the State Department. First up is early warning. Then, to mark this bittersweet transition, President Emma Belcher and Policy Director Tom Collina sit down with Michelle to reminisce over her time hosting this podcast. Let the countdown begin.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
On April 5, 2009, then President Barack Obama gave his well-known Prague speech, in which he outlined his vision for eliminating nuclear weapons. He said, and I quote, "So today, I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons." Unquote. 13 years later, we remain far from that goal. The Biden administration has just released the outlines of its new nuclear policy, and it frankly does not look that different from Obama's. Meanwhile, the fear of nuclear conflict with Russia over the war in Ukraine has brought nuclear weapons back into the public conversation. People are now thinking about the unthinkable again and what to do about it. To help us understand where we are in nuclear policy, we are joined by Emma Claire Foley. She is a senior associate for research and policy at Global Zero, and she has a master's degree from Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Emma Claire, great to have you here.
Great being here. Thanks, Tom.
Emma Claire, give us your sense of how nuclear policy has changed or not changed since Obama's Prague speech.
Well, I think the nuclear policy community today, at least the side of it that's focused on arms control, disarmament, and nonproliferation, really remembers the Prague speech as a relative high point in the recent history of the field. It's the last big moment where we had the leader of the United States setting a course for disarmament, however remote that goal might have been at the time of the speech. I remember that Obama mentioned that it might not be achieved in his lifetime, but that was the ultimate goal. I would say also that if we look a little deeper into that moment, it's really striking how the terms of the conversation have changed. If you look at the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, which came out the following year, the concerns that are named are ones that we very rarely hear from the people presenting our current nuclear policy. Terrorism and proliferation of nuclear weapons were mentioned as the two main concerns. And it's not as if those concerns have disappeared, but they've been definitely knocked out of first place by this increasing concern with what we're calling great power competition, the balance of power between the US, Russia, and China. All of that was kind of there in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, but at a very minimal level. And you find these incredible phrases like, and this is a quote, Russia and the US are no longer adversaries. This is the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review. I would find it hard to find that in any official US messaging about nuclear policy today. But yeah, I mean, beyond just that moment, I mean, I think we've kind of lost a lot of the scale of ambition of the Obama administration. The treaties that were passed during that administration, the Iran deal, New START, a lot of what we're doing now is trying to just maintain those rather than build on them. We could spend much longer time than the time we have talking about what brought us here from that moment, but I think that's kind of the role that it plays in the conversation in the field today.
Now, of course, we have the Biden administration coming out with its nuclear posture review. We don't have the full details. That is still classified, but we do have a public summary or a one-page fact sheet. What do we know about Biden's nuclear posture, and what do you think of it?
It has been a long wait to see the update to the U.S. nuclear posture that the Biden administration is coming up with. And it's interesting to me, especially in the context of this episode, that it is being framed as sort of a reset to the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review. But it's interesting to me as well that the horizons for progress are really foreshortened from that moment. We're no longer talking about, building towards fulfilling the obligation to disarmament, but building towards something much more incremental in itself, like a sole purpose declaration. But what we do know about what's actually in the Nuclear Posture Review could be framed in some ways as a return to the Obama approach. And if you like, sort of undoing a lot of what's been done during the Trump administration. Where we're hearing, I think one of the most hotly contested aspects of this is what's now being called the fundamental purpose doctrine that's in the Nuclear Posture Review. This is instead of sole purpose or no first use. All of this is meant to define the role of nuclear weapons in US military posture as a whole, and to define the situations in which the US might use nuclear weapons. So this is not a phrase, fundamental purpose, that's been used in this discourse. And I think it will be duly picked apart by experts, and we'll sort of start to get a sense of what this should be taken to mean. But this is what's come out of this longer discussion within the field at the government level about the role of nuclear weapons and whether it should be shrunk or expanded. Beyond that, we also have a phrasing that, the US will only use nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances. This is more about the possibility of a first use. Again, I think for the onlooker, it's relatively ambiguous, perhaps by design, but we're going to definitely see more thinking about that in the future. We're seeing some cancellations of Trump-era programs, most notably the sea-launched cruise missile, the B-83, and we're seeing the preservation from the previous Nuclear Posture Review of criticism of the TPNW, of the ban treaty. I think there are different ways to look at this. Is it a continuity from the Trump NPR? Is it a return to the previous NPR? But I think the other huge fact we have to look at here is the military budget proposal of, I think it's $813 billion, which is an amazingly high number. I think higher even than many were expecting, and includes really substantial investment in nuclear weapons. So that, I think, speaks for itself about the direction that our overall approach to nuclear policy is going.
Now, there is more public attention, as we mentioned at the outset, on nuclear dangers today than there has been in decades due to the war in Ukraine and President Putin's nuclear threats. In your view, does Ukraine change the way we should think about the bomb?
I've been thinking about this a lot as someone with a Russia and Ukraine background. And the image that keeps occurring to me is Wile E. Coyote, when he's running out off a cliff and he realizes that there's nothing below him, but it's the moment before he falls. So we're feeling like the horror and the surprise, and we're waiting for the bottom to fall out. And overall, it's unclear what happens next. But I would stop the analogy there because we are definitely at a moment of decision where we can, decide to continue on this path we're now seeing take shape of really just like an incredible leap forward in spending on nuclear weapons, on the military overall. Or I think we can take the lesson that I see in Ukraine, which is a continuation of the lesson that the US perhaps failed to learn during COVID, which is that there are certain threats where simply pouring more money into the military, expanding the range of weapon systems we have, especially, investing more in nuclear weapons, might not help us face these threats. There's an unprecedented level of public awareness of the limits of nuclear weapons and in their ability to help the US end a conflict in a way that they would like right now. And I think if you're in the position as we are of advocating for a better and safer order with nuclear weapons, this is a moment to really talk about that. In terms of other things that are being brought up on that theme, there's also a lot of awareness of what we've been hearing over the past few years with the low yield nuclear weapons discourse. And I put that in very strong quotes because what we consider low yield is, perhaps larger than the only other two times that nuclear weapons have been used in war in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's really important to keep that in mind, that the scale of this is just still unimaginable, even if it's being sort of sold as a lower, like manageable somehow level of a nuclear explosion. So I would say that really intervening to shape that dialogue is really important. And the other thing on the sort of wonkier side for me is that, I've been really immersed in these conversations about Russian nuclear doctrine. Like, is there something called escalate to de-escalate, where Russia would use a small nuclear weapon to sort of force an adversary to back off? That's not clear. But then what we saw in the past few weeks, a threat of nuclear use and an escalation of nuclear tensions in response to an economic attack. And that has never entered the conversation before. So I'm definitely interested to see where that will go in terms of setting a precedent, in terms of understanding, what the actual conditions are in which a nuclear weapon might be used. But the bottom line I want to say is that, I want to return to kind of a theme that came up in the earlier part of this conversation of, ambition, but also being practical about what that means, which is the best assessment of the early Obama approach. I think that, obviously the goal of reducing the threat of nuclear use and pursuing disarmament requires cooperation between the US and Russia. And right now it seems like that is impossible, right? Especially, given recent statements we've seen from both sides about the potential future of this relationship. But I think it's important to remember historical precedent when we have this conversation that, the US and the USSR were not always on the best of terms. In fact, they were often, involved in conflicts indirectly with one another, things like that. And yet they still did make progress on arms control and disarmament. So the lesson here, I would say, is that, that relationship can be functional, even if it's not positive, and that the terms of the relationship can change relatively quickly. I would remind all of us that the 2009 speech came, a year after the 2008 Georgia war that Russia was involved in, which was really seen as a low point in the US-Russia relationship. And, even the speech itself wasn't even 15 years ago. So I wouldn't be optimistic now, but I would definitely say that as people working for better nuclear status quo, there's a lot to work on and a lot to hope for, at least in the longer term.
Emma Claire Foley with Global Zero, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chase Enright, and I'm the development coordinator at Ploughshares Fund. I'm also a dedicated listener to Press the Button and an advocate for eliminating nuclear weapons. Whether you're a baby boomer, Gen Xer, millennial, or a member of Generation Z like me, I believe it's crucial that we learn about and speak up on nuclear weapons issues, because nuclear weapons affect all our lives. That's why in-depth discussions on nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on Press the Button, are so important. To help us continue our work and support the podcast, please donate to Ploughshares Fund. Whether it's $5 or $5,000, every last bit helps. We rely on the generosity of supporters and listeners just like you to fund our work to foster the next generation of nuclear scholars and activists and spread the boldest ideas for reducing the global nuclear threat. As we often hear on Press the Button, our work is more crucial than ever. Please help us keep the conversation going by visiting ploughshares.org and donate today.
Michelle Dover has been with Ploughshares for nearly 7 years, and in that time, she's dedicated her work to investing in the nuclear field, looking for new talent, and seeking out creative new ideas to address nuclear policy challenges. But our listeners may know her best from her incredible and engaging interviews as a co-host here on Press the Button. She's conducted over 100 interviews on the podcast during her time as a co-host. And in a bittersweet moment, this is Michelle's last interview with us before she starts a new position at the State Department. So, instead of her doing the interview, we are turning the tables, and I'm joining Tom to interview her.
Thanks, Emma. And Michelle, great to see you as always. You know, we've been doing this show together, co-hosting this podcast for almost 2 years now. And it has been such a privilege to work alongside you. Every morning, rain or shine, we start the week chatting about our weekends and looking back at the news, both good and bad. It's been fun and deeply satisfying to have spent this time with you, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh my God. I'm getting choked up. I can't believe it's been more than 100 interviews. Tom, I can't believe through COVID, the number of times you have seen the inside of the closet of wherever I happen to be staying. It's really been just a fantastic experience to work with both of you on this, as well as all of the guests who came on and hearing their stories.
Well, we know that our listeners and the guests will miss you, as we will terribly. So we want to just ask you a little bit about your experience, a bit more than just the closets you've been sitting in as you've recorded this, but, you know, your time here and how it's been. So what is the most surprising thing you've learned being a podcast co-host? Did you ever think you would be a podcast co-host?
No, I didn't. Although I think my parents would say that you should never try to take a microphone away from me once you have given me one. So, like all parents, they tend to know these things. The most surprising thing, I think I learned so much about how to listen. And being the one asking the questions, like, what are the right questions that are going to draw out people's deepest thoughts, stories. I mean, the number of times someone has shared something that you can tell they didn't expect to share. I think that was something I found to be really surprising.
Michelle, our listeners may not know this, but we have amazing editors behind the scenes who make everything sound good, even when things do not go smoothly in the interview. So what's the craziest moment you had in an interview that had to be fixed in editing?
Oh my gosh, the craziest moment. There were a couple interviews where I feel like I was doing them out and about, like not in a quiet place. I think the other ones, though, that I can't think of a specific one, but I know that there were a couple times that I just didn't have enough coffee that morning, and every other sentence was a stumble. And so, God bless, whether it was Jacqueline or Derek doing it, they would have to stitch together, my sentences. And I always sounded great, but I know that didn't always go smoothly.
And Michelle, maybe you can't pick a favorite interview, but what is your favorite subject to discuss out of everything that you've discussed?
One of my favorite things, and I haven't been doing this as often now because I don't like putting people on the spot about it. I really love to hear how people get involved in the nuclear issue. I've never met someone who said, I always expected to go into this. I mean, the answer is always, well, I stumbled into it. What does that mean? One of my first interviews, Zia Mian, was also, just really memorable for me, and him talking about how he came to the issue and what it was like to, get support and actually be able to start researching while in Pakistan, in this very different environment than we have here in the US. So I think that's usually my favorite thing to talk about.
Great. And while we're turning the tables on you, we have to ask, what is the Michelle Dover stumbling into the nuclear policy field story?
I can't believe this. I have to give most credit probably to the U.S. Department of Energy for holding a short course and being willing to pay a recently graduated student $500 to go attend. And, I go to this course and I meet these people. I'm like, this is the most interesting group of people I have ever met. You have these scientists, these leaders in technology, but they're telling me the most important thing they have ever done was go to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union to help secure material or help their colleagues that they had worked with. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense to me. Why is that? And I've spent really, I think, the last decade trying to figure that out. Listeners know I did grow up near the Hanford site, so this issue has always literally been in the background for me. But I think, that moment was really important. And the reason I work on trying to eliminate nuclear threats was my cousins were among those soldiers sent to Iraq when the U.S. said that there was WMD. And when I found out there was none, I was extremely angry. And so I have been working ever since to try to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Great personal anecdote there. And I agree. I find the stories about how people got involved in this issue really, really interesting. So great angle on all this. But another question for you. On the podcast or off, what has changed the most in the nuclear policy field during your time at Ploughshares?
We're seeing a generational handoff in the field. When I first started, I heard quite a bit, young people don't care about nuclear weapons. And I would usually be the only young person in the room, and I looked especially young at that point, so they'd always usually look at me. And in the years since, I still hear people say that, but it's usually to a room full of young people. And so, looking around at who is staffing the organizations working on these issues, whether think tanks here in DC, advocacy organizations outside of the district, campaigners for the ban treaty, I see so much talent and so much, not just very young people, but people from all ages working on it, which I think is very different than when I first started.
What will you miss most about recording a podcast?
I will miss having an excuse to sit down with people to hear their stories, hear what they're working on. I think this is also one of the things I've really enjoyed being a program officer is everybody is sharing their dreams with you, their plans. And sometimes it's, at those earliest stages where it's just an idea and they don't know if it's going to work. And that's such a privilege. And so I think, the podcast, it's an extension of that. So I'm really going to miss being able to do that every single week.
All right, Michelle, final question on Press the Button. Drum roll, please. This is a two-part question, so get ready. What is one thing you learned doing the podcast that you will carry with you? And what advice do you have for us as we continue with the podcast?
What I will carry with me is an appreciation for audio quality. And I would like to thank the entire team and Joe Cirincione for teaching me that it really does matter how it sounds. And you don't have to have the fanciest equipment, but you do need to make sure it's a quiet space. So I think, just that appreciation for how you deliver your content matters just as much as the content itself is something I will take. And in terms of advice, I'm going to quickly be the number one listener. I will be leaving reviews every week in public places. But what I'm really excited is to see where you all take it. I feel like the podcast has changed just in the time that I've been on it, in the time that it's existed here at Ploughshares. And I'm expecting it'll be something maybe not entirely new, but definitely something I would not have imagined. So I will be staying tuned, as I hope the rest of the listeners are, to see where it goes.
Well, thank you so very much, Michelle, for your outstanding contribution to Ploughshares, but also to Press the Button, and for your contribution to the entire nuclear policy field. I know there are so many people who've benefited from your wisdom, wise counsel, and steady and lovely voice on Press the Button. We're really thrilled for you in your new venture, and we can't wait to see what you do next. So thank you.
Emma, Tom, thank you so much. It's really been a privilege, and right back at you. Can't wait to see where it goes.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, and all the best.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Keller, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Cepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.